Welcome to YourTown television program. My name is Jeff Kline. I'm your host for this segment, which is sponsored by the Naval Postgraduate School Foundation, where we bring you interesting faculty and students and their activities on campus. For this segment, we have Dr. Jeff Appleget, who is the director of our Wargaming at the Naval Postgraduate School and Operations Research faculty member. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jeff. Glad to be here.
Now, you represent a retired military faculty that's on campus, yet you have a PhD. But before we talk about those interesting things, let's go back to your original service career, which was in the Army. Tell me how a son of Vermont ended up as an artillery officer in the Army.
Well, I got this postcard after my my PSAT, the practice SAT test you take when you're like a sophomore in high school, from this place called the United States Military Academy. I really had no idea what that was. I watched the Army-Navy game religiously and thought that was the Army getting the best football players in the Navy, and I didn't know that was West Point. And so I responded to that and found out that I needed to apply through congressmen and get a nomination, and I did all that from a congressman that I'd never met before, and to this day never met.
So how did you not meet a congressman when you live in Vermont? Is that
And there's only one of them.
There's
one for Vermont, and we have two senators as all the other states do. But yeah, I never met the guy. I never knew whether the congressman or a senator appointed me, because I took the civil service exam, which was a requirement for both of them, and I guess I did pretty well because I got a nomination. But it wasn't until years later I figured out which one of them had nominated me. Never interviewed with either one of them. Never talked to them, never met them.
Wow. And of course, this was after the Vietnam War, so
1974, 75, yeah, exactly.
Well, that's a great opportunity, but joining the United States Military Academy with absolutely no background whatsoever is quite an interesting story. And we have actually a picture of you before and after on your first day of reporting to the Academy. Is that right?
That's right.
So let me hold this up right now. But and you see on your side here a very long-haired high school student, and what's on the left side?
That's me marching out to Trophy Point at 1,800 hours that same day. So in 10 hours, the United States Military Academy cadets take about 4,000 plus. Mostly high school seniors, intermingle with a couple of other folks, and bring them from long-haired hippie freaks to actually new cadets and sworn in for their first oath of office at 1,800 hours that day.
And this was, of course, a culture shock to you.
It was definitely a culture shock, yes.
And yet you survived, because how many years were you in the Army?
I was in the Army for 30 years.
And the first branch that you joined was the artillery?
I joined the artillery. Yeah, in my time at West Point, between your sophomore and junior years, they have a cadet troop leader training experience. And I signed up to go to Fort Lewis, Washington, thinking I'd be able to tour Puget Sound and see the Seattle Space Needle. Well, about 2 days after I got there, the artillery unit that I was assigned to got deployed to Yakima Firing Center, where they did a whole series.
Where's Yakima Firing Center?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was asking. It's like Puget Sound, Washington, rainforest. This is cool. Yakima Firing Center is a desert in eastern Washington State. I had no idea Washington State had a desert. And about 100 plus degrees, scorpions, rattlesnakes. But the cool thing was we got to go fire cannons. I got to participate in a live air assault. And I fell in love with the artillery then, because I got to look inside their fire direction center and look at using geometry and math to put the steel on target. And it's like, oh, this is kind of what I want to do.
Well, what did you study at the Academy?
Well, I studied engineering. I'm an old schooler in that when I graduated from West Point, we all got exactly the same degree, a Bachelor of Science in Engineering. My concentration was civil engineering.
Oh, okay. And so that the Fire Direction Center, the math that's applied to it, actually appealed to you. Well, what was your first tour?
My first tour was at Fort Stewart, Georgia, with the 1st of the 13th Field Artillery. Old 8-inch guns, and
well, now those guns actually had nuclear rounds on them. Is that right?
They had nuclear rounds, and I actually volunteered after I got done a couple of jobs as a lieutenant to be the nuclear weapons officer for the battalion, and that's to manage all the training so that we could assemble the nuclear round, because at that time the old 8-inch round came in 2 cans of parts. and you had to put it together almost like a religious experience.
Well, yeah,
And
I'm sure it was.
it had to be blessed and done exactly right. And I thought that was kind of cool, and I volunteered to do that, not knowing what kind of headaches that would bring me, but very interesting work.
Now, as you went through your career as an artillery officer, the Army, of course, and the Air Force and the Navy always does things a little bit different. You came to NPS. Is that right, for a master's degree or not?
No, I went to RPI for my master's degree. RPI is the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York.
Okay.
And got my Master of Science in Operations Research there.
And then what happened after you do that?
Well, after there, I went to my first tour as an Operations Research Analyst at the Center for Army Analysis. At the time, it was in Bethesda, Maryland. And the first year I was there, I worked on a combat simulation, a new one they had, and was validating the model. And it was sort of interesting work. But the second year there was when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And I got tasked to stand up a team to respond 24/7 to any kind of request from the Pentagon for combat simulation support. And we did about 30 quick reaction analyses in the 7 months that the forces in the Gulf were built up from what we call Desert Shield, from August until the start of the ground war in March. And we actually, the night before the ground war, did a little excursion with the combat simulation on the actual op plan. So that got me hooked as being an OR analyst. It's like, this is really cool. I'm supporting real life operations with combat simulations, and I was hooked from there on.
So essentially, though, the Army, once you do something like that, once you actually get your graduate education area, you no longer, you move from the military occupation specialty of artillery officer to then one of operations research, and you do that the rest of your career. Is that right?
That's what happens today when I'm an old school soldier, and at that point, what was expected was I would do an OR tour and then go back to the artillery and then perhaps go back to an OR tour and see how your career progressed that way. But after this tour at CAA, I was really hooked. And at the time, the Army was just going through a drawdown, so we were losing our artillery battalions right and left. And so the prospect of me commanding an artillery battalion got smaller and smaller. And I liked this operations research stuff I was doing, so I called the OR branch head and said, hey, I'd like to stay and do this stuff for the rest of my career. How about it? And can I go get a PhD? And he said, well, sure. So unlike today, where it's a sought-after fight to get a PhD and you go through school boards and everything, it was me and this other guy having a conversation, and he and I were both kind of ignorant, him letting me go get a PhD and me asking him to go do it.
And you came here for it, is that right?
I came to the Naval Postgraduate School because I'd heard wonderful things about what a great master's degree education it produces. And after I left with my PhD and became a senior Army OR analyst, I told everybody I could that they ought to send every Army OR analyst who was going to graduate school back to NPS, because it was the most applied, most pertinent education for an Army officer to get if they were to become an OR analyst.
Now, what was your dissertation in?
Mine was on integer programming, so I looked at using knapsack cuts and explicit constraint branching for solving very difficult integer programming problems.
Okay, so most of our audience wouldn't understand most of what you just said, but essentially you came up with techniques in order to find optimized type problems and apply those applied mathematics to that programming itself. So you left MPS after you got your PhD. But you came back again, or did you stay here after you got your PhD?
No, I left NPS at the time. I got an assignment to go to West Point to teach. I was looking forward to doing that and kind of maneuvered to get that job. And actually, when I got there, although teaching cadets was wonderful, I wasn't going to stay on with the permanent faculty. And then I looked for a new assignment. And lo and behold, I got this proposal to go back out to Monterey and take charge of the TRADOC Analysis Center.
Tell me what TRADOC is.
TRADOC is a training and, so this is an acronym within an acronym. TRADOC is the Training and Doctrine Command that oversees all the Army schools and educational processes. And within TRADOC is an analysis center, the TRADOC Analysis Center, TRAC, there's another acronym, and their job is to do analysis for the TRADOC commander.
Oh, and there's a group here at the Naval Postgraduate School who actually does that work. We'll have them on the show sometime. and see if we can't get the current commander on there.
Yeah, it's a very small group led by a lieutenant colonel with a PhD, and I happened to fit that bill at the time. And it was a great assignment. My boss was at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, so I had very little supervision, and we did wonderful, great things. And it's a job that probably one of the best jobs I've had in the Army.
Well, let's jump now to actually joining the MPS faculty. You transitioned to the MPS faculty. What is your expertise on that faculty? Although I introduced you as the director of Wargaming, so that sort of foreshadows what you're going to tell me. But what do you teach and what do you do in Wargaming?
Yeah, so it was kind of fortuitous that I got to retire and come here, and I get to teach the things that I did as an Army OR analyst. So Wargaming is the primary thing I teach, and I also teach a course in combat modeling.
So there's a lot of interest right now in wargaming, mainly because the last Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work, wanted to bring that back as an analytical tool. Tell me the difference between wargaming and the combat modeling that you teach, or the simulation that you referred to earlier.
Yeah, so wargaming is a dynamic representation of a conflict environment in which you've got people making decisions and then responding to those decisions or decisions of others. So it's focused on humans making decisions. It's not focused on quantitative output. Contrast that with the combat simulations. These are large computer models that are really created to produce what I call kind of comparative results. And so you'd never want to predict with a combat model, because conflict and combat is so hard to put in a computer model. You wouldn't want to do that, and wouldn't want to rely on those results and say you're going to predict what's going to happen. But you do want to use different computer simulation runs to comparatively look at different eventualities, like what's the forces difference with a new tank or with the old tank? How well does it do? How much better does it do?
Yet, when you teach a wargaming class, what are you teaching your students to do?
So when we teach a wargaming class, we're actually going to take the students through an adventure where they're going to design, develop, conduct, and then analyze a wargame for a real-life DoD sponsor. So the first 6 weeks of the course, they're actually learning how to do wargaming, but on week 2, I throw them a little bit of a curveball. I form them into teams of 4 or 5 students, and each team is going to work for a real-life defense sponsor.
Can you give an example of several?
Yeah, most of the sponsors come from our DoD, but we've actually had international sponsors from Australia, Norway, Canada. Our COCOMs, for example, CENTCOM, PACOM, and Special Operations Command have all been sponsors for wargaming teams.
Okay, so as the students actually get a real-life sponsor you give them, as you're teaching them how to design the game to answer the sponsor's objectives, they're actually doing it with the sponsor?
They're actually doing it with the sponsor, so it's kind of just-in-time education where they're learning something, and I do this in a flipped classroom environment. So the night before they come to class, they've heard me lecture and seen PowerPoint slides online, and then they come to class and we actually do hands-on of the things they learned. And those hands-on products, I've got a dual purpose. They're learning about these products as part of a war game, but those are also part of the war game they're going to produce for their sponsor.
And so we have many resident students who take these classes, but you also have short courses that you travel around the world to give. Is that right?
Yes, I've done, we have what they call the Basic Analytic Wargaming course, and I've taken that around the world as well. Indonesia, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was an adventure. Tajikistan as well. Indonesia, I got to go to Indonesia, and you were along there with me in this course. And the interesting occasion in Indonesia was the deputy commandant of their school, their equivalent of the Naval Postgraduate School. We had lunch with he and the commandant, and we talked about a couple of things. Their English wasn't very good. I couldn't speak Indonesian at all. And the deputy commandant kept talking about the Palm Civet. And the Palm Civet is a critter, looks a little bit like our North American raccoon, but its primary job that the Indonesians use it for is it can pick out really good coffee beans laying there on the jungle floor, and then it consumes them, and in its digestive process, the bean undergoes a transformation and then is excreted back out, and then people collect those beans from what the Palm Civet left behind, and then create a very exotic coffee out of it.
You've actually said this very well, but essentially, this is the way in which you make friends. And we have another picture here of Dr. Jeff Appleget making a friend of an Indonesian Palm Civet right there. They're very calm animals, aren't they?
They look pretty
They're kept for
calm.
pets, and yet as much coffee as they consume. This is a very rich and unique coffee to have. Have you ever tasted it?
I've not tasted it. I did send some to my son. He and his friends drank it, and they claimed it was great. Now these are college students, of course, so I think just the uniqueness of it probably gave it a special ambiance as it was.
Now we've had in the previous segments representatives from the Defense Resources Management Institute and for the Center for Military Relations. All of them have an engaging type responsibility. Yet you also travel around the world in different commands to teach a week-long wargaming course. And as I understand it, very similar to how you do it in the resident course. They actually learn and create the course at the same time. So in a way, you have an engagement responsibility too. Did you have any events in the stands that were fairly interesting?
Yeah, I went to Tajikistan, and we were teaching a kind of a specialized course there. It was about modeling and simulation and in wargaming, so we were kind of giving them a compare and contrast to see what tools that they could develop. And it was an engagement where we really didn't know exactly who the audience was. It turned out to be a handful of active duty Army officers, a couple of academics allegedly from their KGB equivalent, and then a couple of personnel from the president of Tajikistan's Strategic Action Group. And during the course, we learned that one of those members of the President's Strategic Action Group was a retired Soviet colonel. He was a Tajikistan native, but back in the old days, Tajikistan was part of the Soviet Socialist Republic. So during the course, we had a chance to discuss about doctrine and what doctrine the Tajiks used. We had a young lieutenant colonel, active duty Army lieutenant colonel who kind of blurted out that he thought the old tactics they used, which were Soviet tactics, sucked. And the old...
That's a technical term.
Yeah, technical term. And you could just see, I could see out of the corner of my eye, this old Soviet colonel just starting to get red in the face. Later on, they wound up playing on the same risk team, so that's the picture that you see. The young Tajik...
And you're in that picture too.
I'm in the picture too. So
right.
the young Tajik lieutenant colonel is the one on the left in the white shirt, and the old Soviet colonel is the one with the black and white checkered shirt on the right. And they're discussing tactics there. The Soviet colonel wanted to do scorched earth tactics, which the young Tajik lieutenant colonel was trying to tell him it wouldn't work in this game, and probably telling him it wouldn't work in real life as well. I thought I was going to have to play kind of the part of the UFC referee to dive in there and break them apart in case they went to blows.
Well, Jeff, that sort of shows that even though we don't have necessarily an engagement responsibility, MPS faculty that travel around the world, in fact, do engagement activities by the nature of our education. So I want to thank you very much for your service in the Army and at NPS. You're doing important work. I look forward to working with you in the future. And thank you for being on YourTown television
Thank you,
program.
Jeff.
And thank you for joining us for this Naval Postgraduate School Foundation segment of the YourTown television program. We hope to see you again soon to talk about interesting faculty and students at MPS.